Hello, I'm Edwin Newman. Welcome to the Lucy Jarvis Classics. Each of these unique programs allows us to enter a famous place never before seen by television cameras. Each has won many awards. Each was produced by an extraordinary woman whose hallmark is her ability to take her cameras where cameras have never been before. Lucy Jarvis, I suspect that the stories about these productions and how you made them are as interesting and exciting as the productions themselves. The Kremlin has always been one of the most impenetrable places in the world. It's a fortress, and it's the seat of government of the Soviet Union. Lucy, how did you ever pierce the Iron Curtain and prevail on the Russians to let you in? You were the first producer to make a film there.
Well, that's quite a story, and one of the most exciting adventures of my life. I first met Nikita Khrushchev when I was covering President Kennedy's visit to Vienna. I told the premier I wanted to film the Kremlin. 1 year later, he sent word that he was expecting me in Moscow on June 23rd. It happens to be my birthday, and I certainly didn't know he was going to do that.
So you went to Moscow. But I have the feeling, in fact, I know things didn't always happen as quickly there as you would have liked them to.
You're so right. I sat there for 2 months, and then I went to a party at the Austrian embassy and ran into Khrushchev again. This time, I was speaking in Russian. I used my time to study the language. And I asked him why I had to wait so long, and he corrected my grammar. And then suddenly he said, "You and your crew can come in next Monday. Bring your director." So I left Moscow for Paris on a Wednesday to pick up my director, Johnny Peters. However, when I went to the Russian embassy in Paris for our visas back into Russia, they said they'd never even heard of us. But I wasn't giving up. Johnny and I got on the Air France plane without visas, he kicking and screaming, and flew to Moscow.
You weren't afraid that you might wind up in Siberia?
Well, actually, when we arrived, the militia gave us a hard time. But it was Sunday, and they couldn't reach their superiors. And also, they didn't know what to make of this American woman who was dropping names and telephone numbers, and I'll have you know all of their top leaders. I took them out of a book. So they put us in a building, a holding center overnight, and in the morning, my director and I were bailed out by Andrei Gromyko.
Now, I remember, Lucy, you were shooting your film in the Kremlin during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right. And at one point, NBC News became very worried because they couldn't reach you.
That's true. Normally, we worked all night after the Russians went home. One night, they didn't leave, and I was very annoyed. And the next day, our American ambassador, without revealing the full story, simply said, "President Kennedy and Khrushchev were having an argument." After the film was completed, I discussed that whole episode at the White House. And Kennedy said, "Didn't you know, Lucy? I told Khrushchev that night, if he took the missiles out of Cuba, I promised I'd get Lucy Jarvis out of the Kremlin."
A fair exchange. Maybe we ought to be sending you back for renegotiations.
Well, we did develop a relationship with the Russians of sorts. And the film itself was shown to special audiences all over the Soviet Union. It was a reward for their good activities.
Now we're going to have our own reward. We're going to view one of the most impressive documentaries ever made, The Kremlin.
This is Moscow, capital of the Soviet Union. In the center of this city of 7 million inhabitants, an ancient walled fortress overlooks the Moscow River. Best compared to Athens' Acropolis, it is the heart of the old Russian capital. Within its ancient walls, the Kremlin remains a grandiose vision of the past, a symbol of the present. Until a few years ago, it was closed to all but the top Soviet leadership. Now, most of the Kremlin is an open museum, and at given hours, visitors stream in to view the priceless art treasures of the past. But at all hours, the leaders of the Soviet Union and its Communist Party drive through these gates to their offices. From their windows in these government buildings, Premier Khrushchev and his deputies can look out and see the red flag and red star, emblems of communism, topping the Kremlin spires. They can also see the unmistakable symbol of the Christian faith, a relic of centuries of Tsarist rule. This is the Kremlin, museum and symbol, where through the areas permitted to our cameras, we should see much of Russia's history unfold. The Kremlin, with Red Square which adjoins it, it is today the heart of a great atheistic power.
Although the Soviet power was seized in the name of the people, for many years the people were not welcome inside the walls. But now, on an ordinary day, the public is permitted to visit some parts of the Kremlin. The past and the present of Moscow's Kremlin are focused here in the Grand Kremlin Palace, constructed a century ago under Nicholas I to replace one built for the Empress Elizabeth. Our host is an honored officer of the Red Army, the commandant of the Kremlin, Lieutenant General Andrei Yakovlevich Vedenin.
Welcome to the Kremlin.
Thank you, General Vedenin.
Я очень рад, что мне представилась возможность показать вам Кремль.
General Vedenin tells us that we shall relive the story of Russia as he guides us through these historic halls.
Депутаты Верховного Совета Союза, послы.
This is the staircase of honor for important guests for the celebrations of state. When there are heroes to praise, they are greeted here, as were the two young cosmonauts, Nikolaev and Popovich. Musicians on that occasion played Glinka's Glory, Glory to the Russian People. The most lavish of Kremlin celebrations are staged in this great hall, named for St. George, the patron of Moscow, and for the military order of the Tsars established in his name. It becomes a banquet hall, tables laden with food and drink, the heady atmosphere of power and success. The latter-day Romanovs danced here. The present leaders proposed toasts to the ultimate victory of communism. These apartments were made for Romanov monarchs who spent most of their time in Petersburg, only occasionally visiting Moscow. The Soviet regime uses them for small receptions. Here too is held the ceremony in which a new ambassador presents his letter of credence to the Soviet government. Traditionally, all the officers of an embassy accompany their ambassador on this occasion, as when Ambassador Foy D. Kohler took up his duties for the United States in Moscow.
Will encounter the sympathetic cooperation of Your Excellency and of the other officials of the government of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
The Grand Kremlin Palace was conceived as a unity to blend the newer with the more ancient Kremlin. The Tsars lived in a profusion of palaces, interconnected by galleries and passageways. And the best that remains is called the Terems Palace. In the Terems and the even more ancient chapels and halls that adjoin it, we can feel the presence of the terrible Ivan, The first Romanov, Michael. The young Peter, who grew up to hate the Kremlin and eventually built the new capital of Petersburg to get away from it.
Петербург. Вот, значит, все цари до 18 века жили.
General Vedenin is proud of the labor of the new regime to preserve these authentic precincts of the old.
А дальше мы видим уже другую архитектуру, архитектура 19 века, архитектор Том.
Side by side with the oldest area of the Kremlin stands the newest, an architectural leap from the past to the glass and steel of today, the new Soviet Palace of Congresses. The new palace has brought public life into the Kremlin on a large scale. It is used regularly for concerts, opera and ballet performances. A portion of the Bolshoi Theater's season has been transferred to the new palace with its enormous audience capacity. The buffet, offering caviar and champagne as well as less exotic refreshment, is on the top floor overlooking the city and its Kremlin. To the big stage in the auditorium below are brought many important foreign artists, as well as Soviet companies staging traditional Russian classics, such as Mikhail Glinka's opera, A Life for the Tsar. Since its unveiling, the Palace of Congresses has stood like a stranger among its neighboring towers and buildings. But it has one thing in common with them: Western artisans helped to fashion it. These cannon, which decorate the Kremlin's Arsenal building, include many abandoned by Napoleon as he retreated, following the hollow triumph of his occupation of the Kremlin. The arms in this arsenal were a major target of Moscow workers during the Bolshevik Revolution. General Vedenin's Kremlin command is quartered here. The shells for this Kremlin curiosity weigh 2 tons each. The 16th century Tsar cannon never was fired. A companion piece, the 18th century Tsar bell, never rang, but it has a story to tell us. The story of great fires which repeatedly swept the Kremlin, destroying all but the most durable structures. The intense heat from one such fire cracked the Tsar bell before it could be properly mounted. The cathedrals here on Cathedral Square are the oldest surviving buildings. They were the places of coronation and of burial. The Kremlin was also the spiritual seat of power. The faith which these churches, now museums, represent is officially discouraged, but the atheistic state preserves and restores them as treasures of art and history. The Annunciation was the Tsar's family cathedral. When attacking armies began to use artillery, General Vedenin explains to us, the wooden Kremlin walls were replaced by these battlements of brick. They have stood for 5 centuries, sometimes resisting attack, sometimes not. The ornamental spires and tent-shaped roofs on the towers were added when the rulers mistakenly thought themselves secure. The Bolsheviks, the last to storm and capture the Kremlin, repaired the Spassky clock, tore down the structures they didn't like, and restored the rest. These walls, with their 20 individual towers, enclose a triangle of more than 65 acres, with government buildings, palaces, churches, monuments. This is not Russia's only Kremlin. It is the Moscow Kremlin. It is the Kremlin that in almost every age of Russia's history has reflected the character and symbolized the power of Russia's rulers.
300 years before the birth of Columbus, a line of minor Russian princes took over a small settlement on a hill overlooking the Moscow River. There they built a fortress, a Kremlin, with a rough wooden wall. The timber of the wall had hardly aged when it was attacked by Tartars from the east. The Tatar Golden Horde, Asiatic warlords, burned Moscow to the ground. The Moscow princes, to save themselves, bowed to the invaders. They became vassals of the heirs of Genghis Khan. Moscow's crafty rulers emerged rich and strong in the role of tax collectors to the Golden Horde, paying them tribute in slaves and gold. A new Kremlin, protected this time by a wall of white stone, became their citadel. Drawn by the strength of this stone wall, leaders of Eastern Christianity moved to Moscow. They brought guidance and the power of their blessing for their rulers. In time, these princes of Muscovy grew to resist Tartar demands. Again and again, their city was attacked. During more than 2 centuries, battles were fought at the wall. At last, Moscow defeated the Tartars. The Moscow princes were sovereign. They were to emulate the Tartar idea of the absolute, all-powerful ruler. A prince known to history as Ivan the Great was one of Moscow's first rulers to see far beyond the Kremlin walls. He took as his emblem the 2-headed eagle of Byzantium. This symbol of power and prestige became the crest of the Kremlin. Under it, Ivan dreamed of consolidating a Muscovite empire and of making Moscow the new center of Eastern Christianity. To help him create a capital scaled to his vision of glory, he brought to Moscow's Kremlin master builders and artisans from Renaissance Italy. In 1491, the Palace of Faces, or Facets, was completed. In its great hall, Ivan's throne was installed amidst the elaborate ritual, the pomp of a new court. Special openings were built in the wall so that women, barred from much of court life, could watch the proceedings below. Ivan's ordered splendor, a sharp break with a somber past, proclaimed a new era for the Kremlin. Three great cathedrals were built. The Annunciation, designed by Russians, but showing the influence of Italy. In its windows open to the sun, and in the soft, luminous glow of the interior, where court marriages and christenings were celebrated. The Cathedral of the Archangel. Here was consecrated the burial ground of the Kremlin's princes and later of its czars, watched over by holy icons. The Uspensky, the Cathedral of the Assumption, was Ivan's most extravagant effort to build a city of greater glory than Constantinople, to make of the Moscow Kremlin a third Rome. Here, where all the czars were to be crowned, every detail proclaims the glory of Ivan's vision. The frescoed figures, the sculpted altars and thrones, Madonnas and saints, the panels of beaten silver overlaid with gold and precious stones, all these to proclaim, there is nothing above Moscow but the Kremlin, and nothing above the Kremlin but heaven itself. The icon of St. George, patron saint of Russian armies, painted 8 centuries ago. The Virgin of Kazan, said to be an icon of miraculous powers. The Christ of the Fiery Eye, carried into battle by Muscovite soldiers. Another of Prince Ivan the Great's most lasting gifts to his heirs was a massive wall of red brick that still girdles the Kremlin today. It was another, later Ivan, who took for himself and his successors the title of Tsar from the Roman Caesar. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, a despot and a religious fanatic. He ordered a church built to celebrate a military victory. The Cathedral of St. Basil the Blessed in Red Square, just outside the Kremlin wall. Tsar Ivan, the legend goes, was pleased with this monument to his faith. So pleased that he had its architect's eyes put out to keep him ever from creating anything of equal beauty. Life at court was frequently an orgy of lust and drunkenness, interspersed at the Tsar's whim with prayer and bell ringing. Ivan sometimes secluded himself for days in devout meditation. Here he prayed, in the Cathedral of the Assumption. But the search for salvation did not keep him from ordering the assassination of the enemies he felt himself surrounded with. Although Ivan was spared excommunication, his presence in the Kremlin cloisters was ruled a sacrilege. The churches where he had prayed, which he had supported and embellished, closed their doors to him. Haunted by fears of eternal damnation, Ivan built a special gallery on the outside of the Annunciation Cathedral. In it, he prayed, alone. An icon shows the Tsar brooding on his sins that he was to expiate tragically within his own lifetime. It came to pass that Ivan criticized for being too revealing in her dress the young wife of his eldest son. The son came to her defense. The Tsar's native passion flared. The tone grew in violence. Ivan, blind now with rage, raised his steel-tipped staff and struck. The Tsar's heir apparent, his first and favorite son, died in the arms of his horrified father. Ivan never recovered from the blow he himself had dealt. In less than 2 years, he joined his son in death. Here in the Archangel Cathedral is Ivan's tomb. Beside him, 2 of his sons, the one he killed, and another, who became the next Tsar. Missing is a 3rd son, Dmitri, who died mysteriously, still a child. Dmitri's strange disappearance, he was rumored to have been murdered, was to bring about a struggle for power for this throne in the Kremlin. In time, a clever nobleman, Boris Godunov, gained the throne. Tsar Boris built a great bell tower as a gesture of piety, and also to stop rumors that he had been responsible for the death of Dmitri. At the time, the people of Russia were suffering from a severe famine. Superstitious and ignorant, they saw in this calamity the finger of God pointed against Boris Godunov. Then there were new rumors. Ivan the Terrible's last son, Prince Dmitri, was alive. He had escaped death miraculously. This, his tomb, was empty, the rumors said. Legend has it that Dmitri had risen from the grave to hound Tsar Boris Godunov. The Tsar imagined he was seeing the murdered prince in his Kremlin apartments. Boris Godunov died suddenly, some say by his own hand. 2 months after Boris died, the throne in the Palace of Facets was usurped by the man he had feared most, the false Dmitri, the pretender, brought to Moscow by Polish arms. To the Kremlin, that ancient seat of Russian Orthodoxy, he brought his following of Polish advisors. Soon Moscow was rumbling with discontent. Dmitri's Polish wife spurned the Russian Orthodox faith. Dmitri's foreign supporters were his undoing. A mob stormed the palace, killed Dmitri, placed his remains in a cannon, and fired them back toward Poland. Behind the walls, a new dynasty came to power, the Romanovs, who were to rule for more than 3 centuries. Through the gates of the Kremlin where they dwelt came little of the currents of Renaissance and Reformation, which had long been sweeping Western Europe. Their palace, remote within the Kremlin, was a symbol of the country's isolation from Western Enlightenment. The Tsars, absolute rulers, suspicious of everything, trusting no one, lived here in fear of their lives. Outside the walls, Russia was slumbering in ignorance, in poverty, and serfdom. It was to be shaken out of its torpor by a new crisis in the Kremlin, the perennial struggle for the throne. The authority of the double eagle was divided among 3 rulers. On the double throne of this collective leadership sat 2 crowned tsars. Behind the throne, an invisible power. The crowns belonged to a 10-year-old boy named Peter and his half-brother Ivan. Ivan's ambitious older sister Sofia had herself made regent and whispered instructions to the 2 boys through an opening behind the throne. Sofia saw Peter as a threat. She incited the palace guard to riot against the faction that supported Peter. Before young Peter's eyes, members of his own family and friends were hacked to pieces, their bodies flung from the windows. Peter and his mother were sent in a carriage to a village outside Moscow, to a new life. For the next 7 years, the young Tsar was the object of Sofia's intrigues. Peter's main interest was soldiering. He created his own military units, platoons and companies. His soldiers trained to rigorous standards and used the latest weapons of the day. When the palace guards attempted another seizure of power for Sofia, Peter himself and his troops tortured and hanged them by the thousands. Their corpses were left to rot, hanging from the battlements overlooking Red Square, a warning against further dissidents. As the 17th century ended, Peter was absolute master of the Kremlin, but in the atmosphere of its palaces, he found gloom. The Terem Palace reminded him of the brutal events of his childhood. The Tsar had breathed the intoxicating air of Western Europe. The encircling wall of the Kremlin began to suffocate him. The nearly 7-foot-tall Tsar, who would be remembered as Peter the Great, made a bold decision. Boasting that he had taken Russia from non-existence to existence, he abandoned Moscow and its Kremlin. On the Baltic, the waterway to Europe, he founded a new capital to be known as St. Petersburg and turned Russia toward a new destiny in the West. In 1812, Napoleon brought the West to Russia in his own way. His troops captured Moscow and occupied the Kremlin without a struggle. Most of the population had fled the advancing French army. The Tsar's palace in the Kremlin became Napoleon's quarters. The next day, Moscow was in flames. For 4 days and nights, the fires raged. 2/3 of the city was destroyed. The French took harsh reprisals against arsonists and looters. At the same time, their own troops plundered the riches of the Kremlin. For 5 weeks, Napoleon awaited the Russian surrender. As a parting gesture, Napoleon gave orders to blow up the Kremlin, but the attempt failed. Soon, the French retreat was swallowed by the Russian winter. Of the 600,000 men of Napoleon's Grand Army who had marched into Russia, more than half were to die in the snow. Cannons left by the retreating French were hauled back to the Kremlin and ranged along the wall of its arsenal. The candelabrum was made for the Ouspensky Cathedral, made from gold and silver looted by the French, only to be abandoned in the snow. Golden Cross, stolen from the Kremlin bell tower, was recovered and replaced. Russia was victorious. For a century after the defeat of Napoleon, the Kremlin fell into disuse and disrepair. But the solemn tokens of Russia's grandeur behind the Kremlin walls were not forgotten. Here, to the Archangel Cathedral, the Tsars came to pay their respects to their ancestors in this holiest of Kremlin cathedrals. Watched over by the 15th century icon of the Archangel Michael were the tombs of Russian princes and Tsars, from the founder of Moscow to the predecessor of Peter the Great, a chronicle of the Russian monarchy. And here in the Uspensky Cathedral, the Cathedral of the Assumption, every Tsar came to be crowned. The long, solemn procession entered the cathedral behind the traditional censers. Behind the members of the imperial family came foreign kings, selected members of the court, dignitaries of state carrying their regalia. Here was a traditional path to the throne, a legacy of centuries. The ivory throne of Ivan III and Ivan the Terrible. The throne of rubies, turquoise, and pearls of Boris Godunov. The throne of Alexis Romanov, studded with 876 diamonds. The mantle. And the crowns. Crowns of Kazan, Astrakhan, Georgia, Siberia, proclaiming a new emperor and Tsar of all the Russias. Nicholas II, last Romanov to rule, was crowned Tsar and Emperor in 1894. Nicholas reigned from St. Petersburg, but he maintained sumptuous apartments in the Grand Kremlin Palace for those occasions when the imperial family were in Moscow. During such visits, the Kremlin came to life again. Gala receptions were held in the presence of courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and mustached, high-booted officers of the elegant imperial guards. At times, the Tsar retired to this study to meditate, but meditation did not meet the needs of the country. Russia's new middle class led a revolution. After 3 years of war and suffering, the myth of Tsarist power collapsed, and the long reign of the Tsars came to an end. A new regime spread to Moscow and the Kremlin. In the wake of the upheaval, Bolshevik Red Guards gained ascendancy over liberal revolutionaries. They stormed the gates, broke into the wall citadel, captured the Kremlin. Civil war was to rage for 4 years. Moscow was declared the capital. Inside the Kremlin, the hammer and sickle replaced the double eagle of the Tsars. The red flag flew on top of the old Senate building, eventually to be known as Sverdlov Hall. Here, under this dome, the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was to hold its meetings. After a break of more than 2 centuries, the Kremlin once again became the symbol of Russia's destiny under the government of the Soviets, headed by a school teacher's son named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin.
When the Red Star replaced the Byzantine double eagle on the Spassky Tower, the Savior's Tower, the symbol was clear for all of Russia. Today's Kremlin serves the leaders of the Communist Party and the government, and General Vedenin will show us where they work. This building was designed for the Senate, which Peter the Great had created as a leading organism of government. Today, it is the Council of Ministers building. If we were on our way to see the chairman of the Council of Ministers, we would take this staircase to his office. Mr. Nikita Khrushchev's predecessors had their offices here. Mr. Bulganin, Mr. Malenkov, Mr. Stalin, and the predecessor of them all, Mr. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. Within 6 months after the Bolshevik seizure of power in Petrograd, Lenin was living and working here in the Kremlin. His small apartment was just a few steps from his office down the hall, and reflects the austerity on which Lenin insisted in his personal life. The work of inventing his new form of government, step by step as he went along, absorbed him far into every night, and he seldom left this wing of his Kremlin headquarters. With him here, his wife lived simply, for the use of the power they had won to forge the Soviet state was luxury enough for Lenin and Krupskaya. Lenin's last writings were dictated from his bed in the Kremlin, as disease slowly ate away his strength. When he was active, Lenin's days and nights were mostly spent in his office. He studied maps extensively, especially during the precarious days of the Civil War. The small office, with its homely furnishings, had an atmosphere to which Lenin was deeply attached. Here he studied, wrote, made decisions, conferred with visitors and comrades. The calendar remains open to the date of his last working day in this office, and even that day ended only at 8:15 in the evening. Lenin and his commissars, Stalin, Trotsky, Dzerzhinsky, and the others, met frequently usually at night, in a conference room once called the Red Hall, adjoining Lenin's office. Stalin eventually took over the total power and used it for 25 years. Yet we find here today no visible trace of Stalin's memory. The 7th Communist Party Congress, which in 1918 approved the return of the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, approved a party program to make Russia a socialist nation. It remained for the successors of Lenin and Stalin to declare that program fulfilled. They built the new Palace of Congresses for the 22nd Party Congress, where a new program, from socialism to communism, was promulgated. For the new leadership, the Kremlin is no longer a place of residence, but it is still the showplace of power. Among the most frequent visitors to the Kremlin are the cosmonauts, modern heroes, who, when they are not themselves the guests of honor, are in frequent attendance at the other celebrations, the political rallies and international meetings for which the new Palace of Congresses is used. For such affairs and for presentations of the performing arts, vast audiences may attend. There are 6,000 seats in the auditorium. General Vedenin has brought us back to the Grand Kremlin Palace, where 2 richly ornamental halls were remodeled into one large chamber to accommodate the Supreme Soviet. The leading party and government figures always appear at these benches for Supreme Soviet sessions, in which the government's actions are ratified. This hall also was the meeting place for Communist Party congresses before the new palace was built. It was here that party members heard the first famous denunciations of the late Joseph Stalin during the 20th Party Congress. The severe plainness of this chamber is always a surprising contrast to the rest of the Kremlin. The general has proudly shown us the Kremlin inside and out, and as the genial host, returns us to the grand staircase where we began. Thank you very much again, General.
До свидания.
До свидания.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Всего хорошего. The Kremlin gate nearest to the Grand Kremlin Palace is actually in the Borovitsky Tower, but tradition impels a visitor to choose the Spassky Gate. It takes us back to Red Square.
Russia's masses still come to Red Square and the Kremlin, as in the time of Ivan the Terrible, of Boris Godunov, of Peter the Great. Patiently they wait in interminable lines, no longer at the doors of the ancient cathedral of St. Basil, but before a monument of red granite, housing a glass case with the remains of Lenin. Behind Lenin's mausoleum in the Kremlin wall are buried the lesser heroes of the Bolshevik Revolution. Here are the ashes of John Reed, a newspaperman from Portland, Oregon, who became an early champion of the revolution. Ivan the Great looked far beyond the Kremlin walls. Today's rulers look much farther. To them, The Kremlin is the driving force of a tide that must one day, they claim, engulf all mankind. These graves reveal a dimension of Kremlin influence which no Tsar in history had dreamed. Much of Russia today, and much of communism throughout the world, still bears the stamp of one man's personality. He has been compared in the single-minded sweep of his ambition with Peter the Great, in cruelty with Ivan the Terrible. For a time after his death 10 years ago, he lay in honor next to Lenin. Now he has been displaced to a humble resting place, still within the communist pantheon. It bears a simple inscription, J.V. Stalin. The guard changes, the times change. But for the Russians, in the words of one of their contemporary writers, for us, Soviet people, our Kremlin is not just ancient stones, not just a monument of Russian architecture. It is our history. Here in the Kremlin, you feel more strongly than elsewhere, anywhere, our yesterday, our today, our tomorrow.
We hope you've enjoyed this Lucy Jarvis classic. Watch for others soon.